This is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. So went the opening song from the hippie musical Hair in 1967. When the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets, love will steer the stars. This is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. Well, did it dawn? I'm Stephen Coates, and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. As I speak, it may be the Age of Aquarius, but it is certainly summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere at least. 8,000 people gathered at Stonehenge, the mysterious prehistoric temple on the Salisbury Plain, to welcome the sunrise this solstice. Lots of other people were doing the same thing around the British Isles and in many other parts of the world. Continuing hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years of celebrations and ritual perhaps. But the sun was only rising astrologically speaking. Astronomically, it was just that the Earth was rotating. And the summer solstice is just the time when one of the Earth's poles has its maximum tilt towards the sunlight. Astrology versus astronomy. Why are we talking about this? Well, this episode is devoted to the subject of the pagan. And for many pagans, the summer solstice is one of the most important days of the year. And many of those 8,000 people who gathered at Stonehenge, I suspect, might describe themselves as pagans of one sort or another. Part of a counterculture or a re-counterculture that has its roots going back to the pre-Christian era. And we're going to take a whistle-stop tour through that counterculture today. But before we do, have you got a moment for me this midsummer? Have you got a moment to let us know what you think of the Bureau of Lost Culture? For we are gathering reviews for the next stage of our journey into the underground, into the upside down, in this quixotic attempt to build an oral history of counterculture. Send us an email, bureauoflostculture@gmail.com. Let us know what you enjoyed, what you'd like to hear about. And thanks to Ronnie, to Richard, to Kev, to Johnny, Jill and Jess for their kind words, support and suggestions. Now, back to it. For more than 1,000 years, a diverse range of peoples, from Ireland to India, from the Andes to Australia, have been labelled pagan by the Christians who encountered them. Since the 20th century, new groups have emerged: Wiccans, Druids, Neo-Shamans and Heathens, who openly call themselves pagans. But who are these pagans? And what do they believe? Which gods and goddesses do they revere? Do they worship nature? Do they practice divination and magic? Well, I'm glad that I don't have to answer those questions, because I have with me today, as my guest, somebody who I believe can. He is Doyle White, the author, amongst other things, of Pagans, a visual culture of pagan myth, legend and rituals, just published by Thames and Hudson. It's a wonderful, visually stunning and fascinating encyclopedia, if you like, or a survey at least, of this strange thing called pagan. And I hope he's going to answer some of those questions for us. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Ethan. I've got to say, you don't look like a pagan, particularly. I wasn't quite sure how you were going to appear.
Well, I don't really self-identify as a pagan myself. I'm very interested in modern paganism and a range of related religious traditions. So I'm coming at it from a scholarly perspective primarily, but someone who is sympathetic. I'm not antagonistic to the material I describe.
Yeah, well, in your little bio at the back of the book, this is what it says about you. Ethan Doyle White holds a PhD, so you're actually Dr. White.
Yes, yeah.
Dr. White, I'm going to refer to you as now on. In medieval history and archaeology from University College London, and there's research interests in both European pre-Christian religions and modern paganism. So you've got a bit of history there, and that I'm assuming is what brought you to pen this work, and it's quite a substantial piece of work. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I had these twin interests in pre-Christian and indeed early Christian religious practices. That's what my PhD is in, looking at religion in early medieval England, Anglo-Saxon England. But my side interest was very much in various new religions, especially modern pagan religions. So I'd mostly actually written and published academically on that latter subject. And then I wrote one book on Wicca, and then I did a sort of edited volume also on mostly magical and modern witchcraft traditions. And then Thames and Hudson asked me, would you do this book on paganism more broadly?
And just out of interest, I mean, what brought you to... Do you know why you had that interest in the first place?
Oh, that's always a tricky one, isn't it? Determining why anyone is particularly interested in anything. I mean, certainly as a kid, I loved a lot of this kind of Arthurian legend and mythology and fairy tales. And it's quite apparent from a lot of sort of ethnographic studies that actually most modern pagans have that same feeling. They loved all these things as kids. Right. And then as they're older, they begin to be attracted to religious movements that emphasize those sorts of things. So I share a lot of the sort of interests. And I got, particularly in my teenage years, pretty interested in Wicca, pretty interested in modern paganism. I came from a background where a lot of my family were involved in certain esoteric traditions, not really modern pagan tradition, but certain forms of esotericism. So for me, it wasn't a totally alien world space.
Right, esotericism such as
in this case, particularly more things like spiritualism and New Age practices.
Yeah.
So I sort of initially came at it as quite interested on a sort of practitioner level. By my early 20s, it had simply become an academic interest. As I said, a sympathetic academic interest, but an academic interest nonetheless.
I mean, as we were saying earlier, it's quite interesting. We're recording this on the summer solstice.
Yes.
And just this yesterday, 8,000 people gathered at Stonehenge to welcome the sunrise.
Yeah.
There's something going on. Strong. There's always been something going on for sure, but there's something of the moment in this subject, isn't there?
I think, and it's something that's been building for decades. It's not new. It's been building for at least a century, in a sense. This sort of, in a broad sense, romantic interest in the pre-Christian past that you begin to see filtering through, for instance, certain types of Victorian and Edwardian literature. Coming into the 20th century, it's resulting in actual practical forms of modern paganism, and now pervades so much popular culture.
Totally.
Other people.
Yeah, totally. I mean, as I said to you earlier, I spend half my time in Findhorn, which is a sort of centre for New Age and pagan activity. I'm not actually in that bit of Findhorn myself, but it's very strong up there. Yeah. And we were talking about, mid Wales and stuff, and in the West, it tends to be more so. But we're going to sort of circle back to those that modern pagan movements that you talked about. But also, I wanted to sort of put it in the context of the other thing we were saying, which is these pagan traditions. I mean, there's multiple ones, obviously, but as being quite countercultural. And obviously, there was a flowering of interest in them in the counterculture, big C, 50s, 60s, and 70s, evidently. But they were countercultural, or are countercultural to an extent, because they were made so by Christianity, right?
I mean, the term pagan, we're going back to it, as it's I say original definition, but certainly the dominant definition for over 1,000 years has been a explicitly Christian one, used from at least the late 4th century. It's a term Christians use to refer to people who do not worship the God of Abraham. So in that sort of 4th century Christian worldview, you have Christians worshipping the God of Abraham personified through Jesus Christ, Jews worshipping the God of Abraham but not personified through Jesus Christ, and then everybody else is a pagan. It's this real rhetorical divide between us and them. And of course, Christianity is a missionizing religion. It's going out there with the intent of basically replacing all those what they understand as pagan religions.
Because so pre-Christian, which is the phrase that you use quite a bit. It's not like those people went around saying, we're pagans, by the way. No, it was like the word didn't exist, of course, right? As a word, what is the actual etymology of it?
Well, it comes from Latin, which is obviously the dominant language of the Roman Empire. And Christianity comes from the province of Judea in the Roman Empire. And actually in Latin, Paganus was a person who lived in the Pagus, which is a sort of rural district. So in Latin, it meant something like country person, a rustic, maybe a bumpkin, maybe a yokel, may have had some negative traits.
As opposed to metropolitan elite sort of sophisticates. Yeah.
How it then became an explicitly religious term, we don't know for sure. And you have various ideas outlined by different classicists and historians. One that's associated, for example, with the French classicist Pierre Chauvin argues that at some point the idea is that the Pagani, the people of the place, the people of their local area, worshipped the deities of their local area, whereas the alieni, the people from elsewhere, worshipped this incoming god from Judea.
The Christians, right?
So it potentially became a way of differentiating people worshipping gods of the locality, people worshipping a god from elsewhere. That's one of the possibilities.
I mean, that's quite an interesting phrase, though, isn't it? The people of the place, because certainly for some traditions, pagan place, in fact, actually is very important, isn't it? The spirit of the place, the genus loci, and that, that kind of personification of even particular rocks and trees and streams and springs and stuff.
And we see this quite strongly in certain regions of the world where Christianity and other Abrahamic religions never really got a major foothold. I'm thinking in particular of Japan, where you still have sort of the kami spirits seen as inhabiting many spaces of the landscape. But that was only, as I mentioned, that was only one possible origin of how the term pagan became this Christian term. The other possibility actually derives from a slightly different meaning of the word. By the late 2nd, 3rd century, it seems that the word paganus had also come to mean civilian, in the sense of a person who wasn't a member of the army. It's likely that this is a term that actually came about through Roman soldiers. They were not stationed in Rome, they were stationed out in the provinces, and so they came to differentiate themselves from the people around them, the Pagani. Early Christians, thought of themselves as miles Christi, soldiers of Christ. So they saw themselves as part of Jesus' army. If you're not part of Jesus' army, you're a civilian.
Right.
That is possibly one of the other ways in which the term pagan eventually becomes a sort of religious term.
I wanted to drop in something as well, which you said earlier, which I thought was quite interesting and quite worth remembering, which is that when Christianity first got going, it was a cult, right? It was,
depends what you mean by the term, but yeah.
I mean, in the old-fashioned sense of the term, it was a cult.
Yeah.
And it was actually countercultural itself,
yeah,
right? And the actual mainstream culture, which was at the time, Roman Empire, and their sort of polytheistic beliefs. But Constantine, the emperor, converts to Christianity, and that's when Christianity really starts to blow, right? And it becomes imposed. Is that right?
Yeah, ultimately. Under particular Constantine's successors, people like Theodosius in particular, actually begin legislating against non-Christian rituals. So it does begin to be imposed. And this process of Christianization and how it takes place in different regions is still an object of much debate and speculation among historians and archaeologists.
Because Christians might say, people accepted it willingly and eagerly because it's the truth. Whereas there's, and that may have been the case in some parts of the world, I'm not sure, but also there's a lot of sort of fairly brutal suppression, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Charlemagne's campaign against the Saxons being a classic example of where there was a lot of bloodshed through this sort of process. But again, there was probably a mix of the carrot and the stick. And in different places at different times, different processes of conversion became dominant. And of course, we don't just get people converting and then becoming Christians as we would now understand them. It's a process of acculturation that takes decades, centuries. For example, you don't really get the parish church system in England until centuries after the initial conversion. What you probably would have had is priests coming to your local area and speaking to the people at a local point in the landscape that was, people assembled at a large tree, at a well, at a large meeting house. The sort of Christianity of the late antique and early medieval periods is probably quite different from the Christianity as we imagine it from the late Middle Ages or the early modern period, or certainly our world today.
Right, so in a way it would be more of an accretion, really, a kind of sympathetic, sort of more organic thing, rather than some sort of religious conquerors coming in.
It had to adapt to the context in which it found itself.
And hence those churches and chapels built on sacred mounds. I mean, even in St Pancras, there's St Pancras Church is said to be built on a
lot of this stuff is legend, perhaps more than, I mean, the accounts, for example, of St Paul's Cathedral being built on the Temple of Diana. A lot of this stuff is, I mean, it's not impossible, but a lot of this stuff is perhaps more legendary than clearly historic. There are examples in which a church has been built on what could have been a ritual or ceremonial site before it, but there aren't that many of them known. And in those cases, there's sometimes been so many years, so many centuries, sometimes even millennia, between it being a ritual site and the church being built, that it's probably not a meaningful connection. I mean, there's a classic case is Knowlton in Dorset, where you have an earth and henge monument that is sort of late Neolithic or potentially Bronze Age. In the middle is a medieval church. And you would often see, particularly earlier in the 20th century, people cite this as evidence that the Christians were coming in and using a pre-Christian ritual site. But realistically, this was a ritual site thousands of years before the church was built. We have no idea that there was any sort of continuity of practice over that period.
Or as you say, the early priests came to the village, and picked a significant spot to preach from, a mound or a hill or under a big tree, then that itself might become the place where the formal chapel gets built, and then the church, then the cathedral.
Possibly, possibly. And of course, those meeting places may have had pre-Christian ritual significance anyway. It's often very difficult to tell because we are dealing with a period of time when records are
but I suppose that's in terms of place, but in terms of time or in terms of the calendar, right? So, we're talking that we're right at the summer solstice at the moment, Midsummer's Day. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, I have to keep saying that because, of course, in the Southern Hemisphere, it's Midwinter's Day, the shortest day of the year. But I'm assuming that Christmas Day itself, I mean, when I was a kid, brought up a Catholic, by the way, we used to see the pictures of the sort of the crib, Jesus in the crib, with snow on the roof, even though it's in Judea. Seems a bit unlikely. But there's no evidence that, even if Jesus existed and he was the Son of God, etc., that he was born on 25th of December, is there? But that happens to be very, very close to Midwinter's Day, which was this very significant pre-Christian feast. Right?
There's been a lot of argument that the dating of Christmas comes into force in Italy and in relation to the celebration of Sol Invictus.
Sol Invictus being
the solar deity.
Yeah.
So there is a likelihood, I wouldn't say go so far to say it's proven, but there is a clear likelihood that Christmas is there at that date in the year because of its associations with a particular solar deity.
I mean, also it makes sense, doesn't it, if you think about it, because you've got like generations, hundreds of years of people celebrating things at a certain time of the year. Midwinter makes sense, doesn't it? Because you're celebrating the fact of the return of the sun, etc., which has got, life enhancing / threatening consequences depending on what happens that year. Then, people are used to celebrating at that time of year. So they'd be reluctant to give it up, you imagine, because there's a new god in town.
Exactly. And you can see this in our society today. Vast majority of people living in the UK celebrate Christmas. A very, very large proportion of those people are not really Christians. They still celebrate Christmas. The festival continues, even if a religious meaning is sort of dropped, because people enjoy festivals.
We do, and they celebrate Halloween, which is All Souls, and nobody really thinks about that. That's absolutely true, and of course Easter. I mean, I know all this because, as I said, I was brought up a Catholic. The dating of Easter each year. I mean, everybody or maybe everybody isn't aware of this, but Easter moves around each year,
Yes,
and it's all to do with the cycle of the moon, right? And Easter, the egg, we eat chocolate eggs and stuff. So the eggs, I don't recall the egg being a Christian symbol particularly. That sounds
I think
much
the egg
more
is
like
just
a pre-Christian symbol.
I don't know if an egg is an egg. They're ubiquitous in any society that eats and uses eggs. Yeah. It's a springtime symbol. I don't think it's necessarily always helpful to say this is a pre-Christian symbol, because any more than a tree or something is inherently pre-Christian, because it's just ubiquitous in our lives, whether we are members of a pre-Christian society, a Christian society, a post-Christian society. Eggs are still important. Trees are still important.
Yeah, the moon is important,
yes,
of course,
exactly.
And of course, Easter's the date of Easter is determined by the moon. So, just to go back to the book, and I would say about Ethan's book as well, is that it's lavishly and gorgeously illustrated. We're talking about the history here, but the history in this book is this incredible wealth of genuinely beautiful images. So, Ethan, just to go back to the story, so Christianity comes, and we are talking about Northwest Europe largely, right? Okay, I mean, as you mentioned, Japan and other parts of the world. So Christianity takes over and defines this thing called the pagans, which is everybody else, right? Including the Muslims, I think, for a while.
There are debates over some sources will say, well, we kind of accept the Muslims are monotheistic, so they're not pagans, but you still see references that refer to them as pagans.
Right.
I mean, even among Christians themselves, they sometimes accuse each other of being pagans. This is very evident during the Reformation, when all these Protestant reformers are pointing at the Catholics and saying, you've got lavish churches, your ceremonies are really ornate, you've got all these saints, you're pagans.
Yeah, your priests dress up in these fancy garments and stuff like that. Yeah.
It's almost, I mean, it's important to bear in mind that the word pagan in this context has this kind of pejorative meaning. It's not being used to say something nice about somebody. It's a term to denigrate them, to say, you are idolaters, you are living in error, you are making this great mistake about who you are worshipping.
I mean, we've talked about this before on this show. A lot of these terms, I mean, punks, obviously. Beatniks, of course, got a kind of communist thing going on there, and even the hippies. These were all, and goths. These were all kind of terms of abuse. To some set, which later became adopted as badges of honor, and that's what has happened with pagans more recently. But you talk about the fact that Christianity has come to completely dominate Western and Northwestern Europe, and then this thing happens in the Renaissance. Is that maybe coming from an aesthetic background, is that there's this huge interest, literary interest and visual interest in the classical era, in particular, in these pre-Christian traditions, right? And that is this way that this kind of countercultural thing flourishes back into the culture, right?
I mean, a lot of, say, classical literature had been known in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages wasn't completely oblivious to these sorts of things, but it really was in the sort of 14th century in Italy, where you had the Renaissance humanists who really begin to say, look at all this classical culture, look at the literature, look at Homeric epics, look at Virgil's Aeneid, look at Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Look at the statues,
great? Look at the statues,
the ceramics.
Why don't we start making statues like this again? Why don't we start depicting mythological scenes on our art again? And hence you have things like Botticelli's Birth of Venus. You have these really remarkable works of art coming out of particularly Italy, depicting pre-Christian mythological scenes. The society is still very Christian, and you're still getting plenty of Christian imagery being produced at the same time, but there is a renewed respect, particularly among a lot of kind of socioeconomic elites, for this kind of culture. And it starts in Italy, but then it spreads. And you also begin to see over the centuries people beginning to take an interest in the pre-Christian religions of other regions of Europe as well. So in the 17th century, for example, Icelandic medieval manuscripts recalling the stories of what we now call Norse mythology begin to get translated into modern European languages. Thus, growing numbers of people across Northern Europe are exposed to the stories of Odin and Thor almost for the first time in centuries.
Right, so in the south, where, say in Italy, they were living inside the kind of classical legacy, weren't they? You know, in Rome, they were surrounded by it in Rome, so they were more familiar with that stuff. And going back to Greece, but the Norse stuff had been sort of rather forgotten or suppressed entirely, hadn't it? And then so that starts to come back too. Yeah.
And then certainly by the 18th century, this Norse material is beginning to be seen in the visual culture, in the literature. It's beginning to sort of infuse, particularly again, educated sectors of society. Often, of course, depicting these Norse gods in classical clothing. So there is still this engagement and this influence from sort of more Mediterranean societies. And then pushing into the 19th century, when you have the Romantic movement, you begin to see similar things happening in other regions of Europe as well. Renewed interest in linguistically Celtic pre-Christian peoples, linguistically Slavic, linguistically Finnic. You begin to see that interest develop as well. And that's often tied in with sort of burgeoning cultural nationalisms and the emergence of particularly folkloristics or folklore research as a discipline.
I wanted to go back a little bit before because we're about to step into the 20th century, and, the new pagans, and there was two things I occurred to me, which was that in terms of the arts, right? I mean, I just wondered whether these pre-Christian traditions, the Hellenic traditions and the pre-Christian Roman traditions in terms of the arts, they had a lot more to offer than the Christian art did at the time. I mean, they could be more erotic, they could be more sensual, right?
Yes.
They had more sort of scope in some way, didn't they, to reflect modern life as it was then. That was one thing. But also, the other thing which happens, of course, is that you get the kind of second wave, which is the colonization of the rest of the world by the European states, including the Brits, obviously, and we're in Africa, we're in the Americas, the Spanish and the Portuguese are in the Americas, right? And, the British are in India, right, as well, where they're encountering new sets of, inverted commas, pagans, right? And so that has there's a different thing happens then, isn't it? Christianity isn't so successful in kind of like taking over.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, it's very much a repetition of what we saw before in previous centuries in sort of Europe and North Africa and parts of West Asia, in that you effectively have Christian Europeans entering a new place, being confronted with this huge plethora of different religious traditions, not really understanding them, but saying, oh, these are all pagan, or in an English synonym, these are all heathen. It's that kind of approach. I mean, we have these 19th century sources where British colonial writers are going to India and they're calling the native people Hindu pagans. And they're calling what they're doing Hindu paganism. We today would, of course, just call it Hindus and Hinduism. But this is very much the lexicon that they were familiar with and that they'd inherited from centuries before. So they're going ahead with that. But yes, they were less successful in a sense than a lot of their forebears. Because while sort of Christianity has been, and through other forms, say Islam, has been very successful in proselytizing and spreading in many other areas, rarely have they completely extinguished the pre-Christian religious traditions. I mean, if you look in the Americas, yes, many indigenous communities actually are predominantly Christian, but you still do find traditional beliefs existing, traditional practices being carried out, whether that's among, the Mapuche or the Quechua down in South America, or the Lakota and the Salish or whatever up in the north. Same goes for sub-Saharan Africa. You have a country like Nigeria where Christianity and Islam are the largest religions, but these traditional religious systems persevere among, you have Yoruba traditional religion, for example. It still exists.
And also it affects the kind of Christianity that you get there too, right? I mean, you get all sorts of strange kind of hybrid things springing up. One of the things which has been a significant, I think, in recent years, because of the whole drug culture in Mexico, is the cult of Santa Muerta, the skeleton saint, worshipped by the cartels, these bloodthirsty, brutal killers, who pay obeisance to this skeleton saint, who's basically the Virgin Mary, but as a bony version of the Virgin Mary. Right?
Not just the cartels, often the police who are tasked with confronting the cartels as well, because Santa Muerte is a deity for people who are on the front line in some sort of sense, who live a risky life. Certainly there's arguments that have been produced that Santa Muerte has some sort of link to pre-Christian Mexican deities. However, the visual imagery seems to be much more informed actually by the European idea of the Grim Reaper.
Totally.
So, but in a feminine form. As you said, all sorts of unusual syncretisms happen all over the world all the time in various forms.
We've no idea, have we, Ethan, what would have happened if, those pre-Christian traditions had not been vanquished. Either in from the Roman Empire or in later colonialism. But it does sort of go underground and then re-emerges as through these means, doesn't it? Either through subversively, through affecting Christianity and Islam, or through the arts and culture, which I think is quite interesting. And that brings us, in a way, back to the late 19th and the 20th century, which is what you talk about as the sort of the renaissance of this new paganism, right? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, you certainly, one of the important things about, certainly by the 19th century, is that churches are, in a certain sense, slightly less dominant over governance than they were before. You're still talking about Victorian England, for example, as a very Christian majority country. Christian churches still have a lot of influence, but it's not a case where the dominance is total. You can begin to have dissent emerging. And you can see this, for example, through various sort of occult groups, effectively esoteric groups, that begin to develop in Britain and sort of Anglophone Western countries. The two big forces here are the Theosophical Society and then the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And I wouldn't go so far as to call these modern pagan groups, but they are beginning to sort of critically reappraise pre-Christian religions in a positive way. You have, for example, the first temple of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which opens in the 1880s, is called Isis Urania. Isis, of course, being a pre-Christian goddess from Egypt. One of Helena Blavatsky's books, Helena Blavatsky being the founder of the Theosophical Society, one of her books is called Isis Unveiled. Again, there's an invocation
and let's not
Isis.
Forget the kind of the craze for Egyptology in 19th century London and British
Egyptomania,
and funeral architecture and stuff. Right?
I mean, there are some fantastic buildings that have been built under that kind of influence. And of course, just neoclassical architecture, again, something of the sort of 18th, 19th centuries that's reflecting these kind of interests. And it's all coming together, all of these different factors are coming together to result in the emergence of small groups that begin to actively venerate deities taken from pre-Christian traditions of sort of Europe and neighbouring areas where these traditions were actually extinct, but people are looking at the historical evidence for them and saying, we're going to worship that deity again. And that begins to come in a small way in the early 20th century.
Yeah, so Britain in particular, because of the kind of Celtic heritage as well. And
I think not so much actually Britain initially for some of these groups. Britain certainly becomes the epicenter of a lot of it in the 1950s. But in the earlier part of the 20th century, there seems to be more going on actually in Germany and Austria. Okay. Where you begin to get these early, usually ultranationalist, Volkish groups that are very interested in reviving, as they would see, ancient German deities for the German race.
Right, and the Wagner and
the drawing of Wagner, and that sort of stuff. You then begin to get other groups popping up here and there in parts of the linguistically Slavic world. In sort of areas like Britain, for example, someone like Aleister Crowley and the religion he establishes, Thelema, it's not always seen as straightforwardly modern pagan, but it's certainly invoking pre-Christian deities, especially from ancient Egyptian sources.
It's using divination as well.
Yes.
Through tarot.
Yes. Although I would say that tarot is popular among a lot of pagans, but I wouldn't call it a modern pagan practice because it can be found being performed by a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. Yeah.
But even then, a couple of episodes ago, we had Annabella Pollen came in to talk about the Kindred of Cave Kift. Doesn't necessarily call them new pagans. In fact, they may have called themselves Christians, but But it had these kind of pagan elements, which
Yeah.
was, maybe we could talk a little bit about what that means here.
Yeah.
I mean, massive subjects, obviously, but
Yeah.
it's this kind of re-interest in nature, isn't it, as
Yeah.
well? And the land.
Yeah, and the connection of the land to the distant past, I think,
Right.
is part and parcel of it. There are people playing in the modern pagan ballpark, even if they're not modern pagans themselves. They're clearly displaying many of the same interests that modern pagans display. So you have groups like the Kibbo Kift, like the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry, and then you also get a lot of poets and writers. Again, not people who would be modern pagans explicitly, but who are clearly very interested in things like an enchanted landscape or certain pre-Christian deities. Look at the wind in the willows. It has a scene
With
in which Pan appears.
Yeah, right.
This sort of stuff is actually becoming more and more evident, certainly in Britain, in the Edwardian period into sort of the 1920s as well. Also,
You mentioned earlier the town of Glastonbury, which had this kind of Arthurian connection, which is, Arthur is sometimes described as Christian, but not always. The woman Fortune, she kind of started to transform Glastonbury itself into what it's become, not just the site of the festival. There's no coincidence that the festival's there, but it's become a kind of centre for new pagans, right?
Yeah, I mean, the woman in question was, her real name was Violet Firth, but she went by the name of Dion Fortune.
Here is a sidebar about the Wicca woman. It's important to note, thankfully, that women play a much greater role in the new pagan and possibly the original pagan religions than they seem to have done in the Abrahamic religions. Dion Fortune, born Violet Mary Firth in 1890, was a British occultist, ceremonial magician, novelist and author. She was co-founder of the Fraternity of Inner Light, an occult organisation that promoted philosophies which she claimed to have been taught to her by spiritual entities known as the Ascended Masters. A prolific writer, she produced a large number of articles and books on her occult ideas and authored 7 novels, several of which expanded occult themes. Like Gerald Gardner, she was born to a wealthy upper-middle-class English family, and after time spent at Horticultural College, she began studying psychology and psychoanalysis at the University of London, before working as a counsellor in a psychotherapy clinic. She became interested in esotericism through the teachings of the Theosophical Society, before joining an occult lodge led by Theodore Moriarty, and then the Alpha A Omega Occult Association. She came to believe that she was being contacted by the Ascended Masters, including the Master Jesus, and underwent trance mediumship to channel the Master's messages. In 1922, along with fellow member Charles Loveday, claimed that during ceremonies they were being contacted by masters who provided them with a text, the Cosmic Doctrine. With Loveday, she established bases in Glastonbury and Bayswater, London, as Ethan described. During the Second World War, she organised a project of meditations and visualisations designed to protect Britain. She began planning for what she believed was the coming post-war Age of Aquarius, but sadly died in 1946, age 55 of leukemia. Dion is recognised as one of the most significant occultists and ceremonial magicians of the early 20th century. The fraternity she founded survived her, and in later decades spawned a variety of related groups based upon her writings. Her novels in particular proved an influence on later occult and modern pagan groups such as Wicca.
She would have considered herself a Christian,
Right.
but again had these sort of sympathetic interests, particularly at certain points in her life, with pre-Christian deities. She, for example, wrote a novel. She wrote a number of novels, but one was called The Goatfoot God. Again, this interest in Pan that we saw in The Wind and the Willows, and that was very pervasive in a lot of Edwardian culture. And her group, the Fraternity of the Inner Light, they were London based, but they had property there and in Glastonbury. And Glastonbury had certain esoteric associations, actually going back even further, but drawing on the legendary complex that existed around Glastonbury, associating it with the burial place of King Arthur. and that had existed since at least the Middle Ages.
And there's to tie in with Christianity too, there is this legend that Joseph of Arimathea comes to these shores.
Yeah.
And, in Blake's and did those feats in ancient times.
Blake was born around the corner from where we are now.
Yeah, well, that's right. Blake, of course, in a sense, he wouldn't have described himself as a pagan.
No.
But actually, he is a kind of figurehead for some of the new pagans, right?
I mean, Blake has inspired a lot of people. I think he is probably one of the... Perhaps one could call him a mystic. Certainly, he has been of great interest to a lot of people with esoteric interests of various kinds. Christian esotericism, but also modern pagan esotericism as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, cycling forward to the 50s, and as we mentioned, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which of course is the name of a Pink Floyd album, straight into the heart of the counterculture with a big C. So it's given a kind of big shot in the arm, isn't it? Here too, there's suddenly like a great deal of interest. There's an re-interest in Crowley, who'd sort of fallen from favour, as it were. And the counterculture itself and hippiedom and all that came with it, the psychedelics, suddenly, the idea of the new age starts to emerge as well, doesn't it? Which is connected with all this stuff, isn't it?
I mean, you certainly get this sort of broad milieu, or whatever you want to call it, zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it.
Zeitgeist,
and modern paganism is one current within that. I mean, it actually, certainly in the British context, with the emergence of Wicca, which is now the largest of the modern pagan religions, probably the best known, that is certainly coming to public awareness in the early 1950s. Gerald Gardner, the man we often refer to as the father of Wicca, publishes a book in 1954, Witchcraft Today, another book called The Meaning of Witchcraft in 1959, appears in the press quite a lot. So even in the 1950s, he's beginning to become a sort of publicly recognisable figure. And his Wiccan covens are being formed in various places around the country, and then actually in Australia and the US as well.
Particularly in the US, right?
Yes, eventually. I mean, it's a much bigger country, much bigger possibilities in that sense. But this is something that obviously appeals to a lot of what you might call hippies or people with countercultural interests. And you have other movements that are also burgeoning around this time, like the Earth Mysteries phenomena, which I wouldn't say is a modern pagan phenomenon itself, but it's clearly, again, it's in the same ballpark.
Earth Mysteries is like a reinterest in, say, the notion of ley lines, like symbolic lines of power or force connecting different significant places across the landscape. And also, the reinterest in prehistoric archaeology of these islands, the stone circles, the henges, the mounds. There's a kind of, all that stuff is coming back big time, isn't it?
A shared... Fixation is perhaps too strong a word, but in some people's cases, yes, it was a fixation, but certainly a shared interest in the ancient past. So this is something that you find very much in Earth Mysteries, also something you find very much in modern pagan religions, also something you find recurrent in a lot of what you might call New Age movements. So there is this sort of shared idea that's evoked by a lot of different people involved in a lot of different things.
Ethan, I wanted to ask you to just define a few things, because in the book you talk about, you talk about in America how much stronger it is there, but you divide. There's these kind of broad divisions. You've got the Wiccans, the Druids, the Heathens. Yeah. So just give us a quick sort of rundown of what you understand those things to mean.
Well, I would say each of those is a different modern pagan religion. Wicca, typified by the fact that practitioners also consider themselves to be witches. Their theological perspectives are quite diverse, but will usually involve a goddess with or without a god, celebrating seasonal festivals called sabbats, of which there are usually 8 each year, including midsummer. And their rituals usually take place in a circle and are usually described as being magical, and thus involve things like spellcasting. So, in a sense, Wicca draws on both traditional imagery and stereotype of paganism, but also traditional imagery and stereotypes of witchcraft, and merges the two. Modern Druidry takes a different stance in that its practitioners adopt the identity of the Druids. Now, the Druids originally were these sort of ritual specialists, priests, whatever you want to call them, of certain linguistically Celtic societies during the Iron Age. They were suppressed by the Roman military as a potential threat to Roman imperial control. But modern Druids adopt that image. They adopt that identity for themselves and are typically very nature-centered in their practices, usually performing rituals outdoors, and they also typically place a great deal of emphasis on poetry and the arts as a means of ritual expression. Heathens are people who venerate the deities of linguistically Germanic pre-Christian societies. So people like the Norse, people like the early medieval Anglo-Saxons, deities like Odin and Thor, these sorts of things. Not all favour the term heathen. Some prefer to refer to it not as heathenry, but as Asatru or Odinism or Fornsida. There are different terms used, but heathenry is nowadays it's the most commonly used one. And of course, there are other modern pagan religions as well, smaller ones, and others that are more popular in other countries. For example, in a lot of linguistically Slavic countries, you have Rodnovery, which is an attempted reconstruction of the religious traditions of pre-Christian Slavic peoples.
I mean, you say that's what they've all got in common is that they're trying to resurrect something of these lost pre-Christian religions. That's the thing that they kind of share.
That's what makes them a family, as I see it.
Yeah. And there is these kind of common themes like personification of objects and places, pagan places and nature. But I've got a question for you, which is that, and I had an interesting experience recently, which is that I was up at Jodrell Bank. Now, Jodrell Bank is the site of the Lovell Telescope. It's a huge radio telescope in Cheshire. And there's an exhibition centre there, and it's quite amazing because it puts Jodrell Bank, the radio telescope, into this lineage of solar observatories, including Stonehenge, including, I think, Maze Howe, and including the one in Ireland, Newgrange, and of course the Mayan temples and stuff. And I thought that was a wonderful thing to do. And they've got all these incredible images of pulsars and black holes and other galaxies and stuff. Beautiful things, right? But what I realised when I was looking at these beautiful images is that these are actually metaphors. They're not as these things, black holes and pulsars and redshifts are, because we can't actually perceive them. What they've actually done is taken radio waves and then they've transposed the wavelengths into a band that we can actually see visually. So they've got wonderful colours and they look amazing, but they don't look like that, right? That's a transposition. In other words, it's not the way things are, it's a version of that we can understand. It's a metaphor, right? Well, the sun as a god was a metaphor, right? I mean, we know the sun isn't a god. We know it's a ball of gas, right? But when the sun rises, if you're sitting on a beach, particularly, with somebody that you like, you feel something, right? Your response isn't to a ball of gas, and it's not even rising, it's the earth that's tilting. Right, you still have a kind of pre-Christian, if you like, a pagan response to it, right? But what I'm getting round to sort of saying is that we know that these things were metaphors, that the sun isn't really a god. And we can also acknowledge that, the way that pulsars are shown is also a metaphor, that our metaphor, our latest version of reality, right? But isn't it a bit silly to sort of revive the Norse gods? Isn't it a bit silly to take the metaphors of the Greek gods and sort of, still or try and revitalize some ritual about them?
I mean, everyone should be free to do as they will to some extent. That is my my perspective on it.
I think so too, but I'm just asking, it's because at one level I'm very glad that people are doing this stuff, but there's another part of me, maybe a little bit of a cynical part of me, which says that, but it's a bit silly.
I mean, some practitioners very much do see these as metaphors, as symbols. Often they consider them as archetypes, particularly through a sort of Jungian perspective. And will say, well, actually, okay, the god Ra, the god Thor, the god whomever it may be, doesn't literally exist, but it is a symbol that is useful to me and my group in our ritual. Other side of the coin, there are people who, in the modern pagan communities, who will say, no, this deity literally exists. I am in communication with this deity via processes of divination or whatever it may be. So you do get very, very different theological beliefs within these sorts of communities. And often the thing that brings them together is more sort of ritual shared ritual space. You can have 3 different people taking part in the same ritual who have very different understandings
of what's going on.
What is going on. And that is often quite a common thing within a lot of modern
I mean, and by the way, I find the Abrahamic God as silly myself, belief in that. It's like the tooth fairy. For me personally, it's like we don't believe in that anymore. But
some people do.
Some people do. Actually, that's true. Sorry, if your tooth's just fallen out and you're expecting to get a pound and you put it under your pillow, I apologise. And Santa does exist. Let's say he does. But you're right. I mean, for sure I respect them. And I think what you're saying there is that there's different degrees of belief in the literalism of these deities. Now, listen, I've had experiences myself which are mysterious and seem to have connections with like non-human intelligence and consciousness, as well. So I'm certainly not taking a secularist point of view on that. And in fact, there's the whole area of psychedelics, and of course, you might call the shamanic aspect of rave culture, which came to this country in the 80s and 90s. Along with it, a lot of the things which we associate with maybe in traditional societies or new pagan societies, which is the festivals, right? The traveling communities, right? Tied up with music, gathering in large quantities, shamanic experience of kind of losing yourself in altered states, right? So there's that whole thing which doesn't necessarily have to tie itself to belief in any particular deity, right? But has something of those pre-Christian traditions too, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is again a lot of these sort of communities, things like the New Travellers, things like, as you said, the Ravers. There are transmissions of influence from the 60s, 70s counterculture, but also things like, as I said, Earth mysteries. The influence of Earth mysteries on the New Travellers is quite evident, for example. So there are, again, all these sort of, this web of links between all these kind of countercultural groups that exist, and the way influences can pass over the generations and be transformed in doing so, but continue to influence people. I mean, the New Travellers being quite a good example of people who were very interested in sites like Stonehenge and in solstice rituals at sites like Stonehenge, and would often be there performing, or perhaps performing is the wrong word, but they were gathering there for these solstices alongside modern pagan druid groups that were performing rituals there. So there are a lot of people kind of active in this broad milieu, definitely. And there were certain individuals definitely who were involved in some of these subcultures who one could say are modern pagans. I mean, going back to kind of rave, you have this slightly, not necessarily rave itself, but groups like the Temple of Psychic Youth, which is overlapping with rave, if you could say. And some of the people involved in that certainly had definite modern pagan interests. People like Genesis P. Orridge, people like going into John Balance of Coil. These are people clearly interested in these sorts of religious perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely too. And of course, more recently, even into the context of film, and all the cultural stuff, there's the folk horror thing, revival, right? I call it. I mean, the Wicca Man is actually showing this weekend at the Barbican with a live score, and there's a so it's in the culture still, isn't it? In fact, it's possibly even becoming less countercultural and more sort of cultural, as we could sort of say. And this weekend, of course, is Glastonbury Festival, which neither of us are at, interestingly. So one might even say that the pagan is alive and well in our culture.
Yes, absolutely. I think, and ever more so. I think in a lot of ways, as Christianity is declining in terms of its actual number of adherents in basically every Western society, we are finding ourselves in an increasingly religiously heterogeneous world. In 50, 100 years' time, we're going to have a society where most people probably don't identify as religious. This is not the same as saying they won't have religious, spiritual, supernatural beliefs, but they won't identify themselves as a particular member of a particular tradition. with probably minority groups of Christians, Muslims, and of course pagans and Jews and Buddhists and what have you. So we're going to end up in a situation that in a certain sense is more like that of the Roman Empire than of these Christian majority societies we've been used to in this part of the world for well over 1,000 years.
We're going to end up with a polytheistic society, basically, rather than a monotheistic society.
Possibly. I think it's going to be certainly a very mixed society with a lot of people believing a lot of very different things to one another.
I think the actual stats on it are that, when polls are taken about who believes in the supernatural, it's very much the case. I think, the majority of people have got some sort of supernatural beliefs.
Exactly.
What's quite interesting in Findhorn, what happened is that in Findhorn, there's the Findhorn Foundation, which is the UK's oldest alternative community now. In the late 50s and early 60s, the people who founded it, who were kind of broadly sort of New Age Christians, well, they were actually a UFO cult, and they believed that, extraterrestrials were going to land on the shore just outside my house. And they didn't, as far as we're aware. And then their beliefs about extraterrestrials morphed into this belief in devas, local nature spirits, and they were in communication with them, and that's why they were able to make these beautiful gardens. And the most recent kind of evolution of that metaphor is what they call the Findhorn angel, which I don't think they regard as a sort of actual literal being, but it's more like the genus loci, the spirit of the place. And in my own experience, actually, I would say that in the urban context here in London, there has been, of the recent decades, really, is this sort of what you might call psychogeographic movement, which is actually pagan in a sense. It sees significance in place, significance in roots, and the echoes of time, that time is not linear, and that there is something significant going on in these streets of sad old London.
Yes, and I think in many ways it's the psychogeographical movement is almost a lot like the Earth Mysteries movement that we talked about that was coming out of kind of the 60s with people like John Michel, although the psychogeographical sort of approach tends to be a bit more urban oriented. So, and again, certainly there are people who are involved in modern pagan traditions who also have these kind of psychogeographic interests, much as they did in the 60s with Earth Mysteries interests. There's always a lot of overlap when you're dealing with these kind of, for want of a better word, countercultural subcultures.
Ethan, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you for having me.
Well, folks, by the time you hear this, I just realised that, in fact, summer solstice will be over. Today was the longest day and the shortest night of the year here in the north, and the sun was at its highest position in the sky. At the North Pole, there was 24 hours of daylight, and none at all at the South Pole, and that doesn't sound much fun. Now in the north, the nights are getting shorter. And to be honest, I quite like that. I'm more of an autumnal guy, put it that way. I don't really know what to wear in this hot weather. In 6 months' time, it's the winter solstice, December 21st for us. Much more importantly, that's my birthday. Mark it in your diary. I always felt a bit ripped off when I was a kid when people said, oh, it's the shortest day of the year. Now, I'm quite glad. Well, whatever the season, we will be keeping recording story, digging for these buried treasures, and celebrating counterculture with guests like Ethan. I'll put a link to his wonderful book, Pagans, in the show notes. And, of course, we'll keep celebrating and digging and recording with your help. Join us at bureauoflostculture.com. You'll get our newsletter and various bonuses that are coming down the road. And don't forget to write to let us know your thoughts, suggestions, and a review of the show. That will really help us as we move on. bureauoflostculture@gmail.com. Thanks to Rachel, Esmeralda, and Adrian at Soho Radio. Thanks again to Ethan. I really enjoyed our conversation. And thanks to you for listening. See you, hear you next time for more tales from the counterculture. Let's finish with a tune by our old sponsor, the artist known as The Real Tuesday World. This is Slinky.